position to think about the real important side behind, and just to introduce you to the idea that APM, remember, is all about technique. You've got to manage your time. Remember, sit down in terms of how and what I've put across to you guys in terms of sitting here with the 3 questions. You've got 195 minutes, 95 on the first one, then 250s on each of the section B questions. Don't overrun the time, guys. Don't overrun the time in terms of this. But remember, when you're within the question as well, think about this. Don't start writing at the beginning. Open up all of the headings. But also remember the second part. Once you've got all the headings up, that you can move between the headings. So you can put some nice easy bits in relation to each of those items. So when we can see in terms of that, we can actually put that on there. Syllabus-wise, remember, it's about 20-25% technical knowledge, 70-75% or so, the balance basically being in terms of technique and procedure. So have a confidence in yourself and let's see where we're going. I've got a list of questions here. I'm just going to run one down from the top. So sitting on the top, so it's Tanya on top. Hello, Tanya. I can see your question, Tanya, in my list. I'm happy to deal with it here tonight, or I'll get onto the list probably in first thing in the morning and deal with that personally if you prefer. Panis, read Mock 2, question 2 required. Explain why identifying improving quality is important for the future of the backs. Indeed. So you questions. So the question there, Willina, nice to see you. If we would build on the speed, different reload cost and flexibility squad, that would be a correct answer. It could be a possible answer. Panis, it depends on what you're saying. Well, in terms of Mock 2, so the mock question 2, explain why identifying improving quality is important for the future success. Now, I think I was looking for things like mentioning of critical success factors, basis for competitive advantage, possible competitive disadvantage, important about meeting customer expectations. I was expecting things about value-based management, the idea that if we could deliver value, and which you will do by delivering in terms of quality, that we should be moving forward. So quality can be defined by many things. Remember, quality in very simple terms is exceeding or meeting customer expectations. So what I was looking for you guys there is to tell me about in terms of how a focus on quality could help us move away from some of the problems the case company was experiencing. What I didn't need to see was a whole load of, this is how we're going to solve this problem and this problem and this problem. You can't possibly solve the problem. And I wanted to know how quality would actually help in that relation. So the possibility of improving speed, but certainly reliability, because if you think about the idea about in terms of quality itself, it's all about the balance, even in terms of moving to a TQM environment, of the balance which was in section C about the idea of conformance and non-conformance costs. So overall, the situation wasn't the greatest answer that many people put together. There was far too many people say, well, this is how we're going to deal with this problem and this is how we're going to deal with this problem, without actually putting much APM in there. And remember, guys, this is an APM exam. So you need to demonstrate your understanding about the application of APM principles. And so the more APM principles you have available to yourself, the more you can demonstrate you grasp the principles. So in terms of Panis, what it was talking about in terms there, yes, I think you've got something that you could pull from that list that you've got in place, but you're going to have to tell me why, in terms of why it's important in terms of this. Anything about competitive advantage, disadvantage, critical success factors, and also about the fact that if you were focusing on quality, we could start to use it to maybe think about justifying or even moving towards a cultural change. Because clearly in terms of question 2, there was needed to be a change that's taking place in there. So in terms of that one, I hope, Panis, I've answered your question. If not, please come back and I'll see what happens in relation to it. Tanya, your question sitting in here. When we're asked to evaluate the effectiveness of suggested KPIs, in other words, well, actually in terms of the situation for the not good KPIs, it's a good idea to suggest new ones. No, Tanya, if they want you to suggest new ones, they will say to you, please suggest new ones. What they're going to ask you is to evaluate the KPIs. So for you to evaluate the KPIs, if you remember in terms of evaluating KPIs, you need to come down the list. One of the things you need to ask, first of all, is to look into the case, as you've correctly identified here, Tanya, and identify those critical success factors or objectives that are in the case. And then decide whether your mix, the actual batch of KPIs that you've got there, would help you meet. So to what extent would they help they meet, and to what extent would they not? So if you have objectives talking about increasing web presence, improving staff turnover and maximizing shareholder wealth, if you've got ratios based around finance, then they could be vaguely linked to financial wealth or health even. But on the other side of it, of course, if there are none on web presence or HR, then you should note the difference or the lack of them. If you're coming down to evaluate KPIs, you need to ask yourself down that list on that slide. Remember, the first thing is, do I have a balance of financial and non-financial? Yeah, pretty good. Do they fit in with the case in terms of putting in position there? Next up, do I have conformance and non-conformance? Next up, do I have upstream and downstream? If you have both of these, you can talk about a balance. And all of these are going to lead you towards raising the question about that they will be relevant and that they could be quite useful there. You could also then start to fine-tune on particular ones where perhaps you could put into the position and say, well, if the case is telling you about a particular problem, you could identify the fact that a KPI could indicate that problem and therefore start the change process. Remember the justify and demand change that exists in the front of the Jim mnemonic. Do you remember those three key purposes behind measurement within a business? Is to justify and demand change, indicate and inform progress or context, and to monitor and control your progress towards the achievement of the objectives. So Tanya, if they're asking you to evaluate the KPIs, there's three things. This is what's good about the mix we've got. This is what's bad about the mix we've got. Here is my concluding sentence. What you'll tend to find is they'll then follow on and the CEO or the chief exec will say to you, can you make recommendations for 3 or 4 or 5 new KPIs? And they're going to almost say to you, justified recommendations. But in terms of answer to your question, in terms of this position, if they ask you to evaluate the effectiveness, evaluate something means I need plus points and minus points in a concluding sentence as to how good it is. And if you start telling me about what we need for new KPIs, then you are answering a question that hasn't been set. Okay? So remember, just look at the question, don't build upon it. Hopefully, Tanya, I've answered your question just there. Right, I think in terms of Mock 2, we've got any other questions floating around in there? We've now run out of questions. So in terms of our positions, let's go and start to develop. And I'm going to run you through a few ideas and to think about this. Remember, the two reasons people fail APM is they don't read the question and they don't manage their time. So it's really, really important. Now, Tanya's point that she's raised here in the discussion room is very, very relevant to all of you. Because in every examination since about 2011, when this current examining team have been in place, they have asked you and basically said either getting you to recommend KPIs or to justify your recommendations or to offer some criticism about the KPIs that already exist. Remember, there are some things that you can learn in relation to the return on capital employed. And the ROCE is absolutely central to all of this. You need plus points and negative points. I'm sure you've already looked over many now of the past examination questions and seen the regular visit of return on capital employed as it's appeared into our measurement mix. And so in those cases, there's something we can prepare in advance in relation to this. And I'm just going to borrow one of our revision slides that's sitting down here, which I'm hoping is sitting, yeah, there we go. Let's put this revision slide up in here, and we can have a look at some of our key aspects behind it. In terms of the return on capital employed, I feel there's a very, very definite effect in the situation about the ROC and how it's going to put into position. From your revision slides on 17, sitting down in terms of our pointers just here, let me just put that up on the top of the screen so you can see it. The return on investment, the idea of the return on capital employed. I've put some positives and some negatives during our time together. And it's like one of those things that so many people think about return on capital employed, and it does have good points, and it is a worthy inclusion in a range of performance measures. But no, you know, the smaller the range of the measures, the greater the difficulty here. And on the bottom here, if I'm just going to move this slide up a little bit, we have the basic formulas of return on capital employed and the return on equity. You could be asked basically to come round to these situations and then come round into position to calculate both of those. Right, okay, let's just take a time out. Kohler, you've got a question. If a question is as what is 360-degree bad, for example, are we to give example from the scenario or outside? Everything, Kohler, comes from the scenario. Everything, these are cases. You can't include something that is irrelevant to the scenario. So in terms of this situation, you're talking about 360-degree feedback. If you're talking around that, you'd have to clarify exactly what that is. In relation to the positions, I think we would probably talk about participative discussion. But no, if it's not in the case or it's not relevant to the case context, you can't use it. And remember, if you are going to be using this, Kohler, you're going to have to justify why it's there. So simply plucking it out of thin air isn't going to do it. So it's going to ask what is 360-degree, for example. It's not going to ask you what is 360-degree feedback. How often do they ask you what is? Occasionally they ask you to explain something, like in June they asked you to explain the quality costs sitting down there. And they asked you to explain what velocity, variety, in terms of those things that's sitting there. Velocity, variety, and those positions, those three feeds of the data capture, the three management styles that you've got on there. Small parts of the question, very, very few in relation to it. But in terms of, you're looking at the stars here in terms of this 360-degree feedback, they're not going to ask you a question on what is it. I mean, if you want to talk about bringing it in, I'd rather use the APM principle if that's possible, Coda, and tell them about the idea of participation, for example, participation in setting budgets and participation. They're not going to ask you a question on what is it. I mean, if you want to talk about bringing it in, I'd rather use the APM principle if that's possible, Coda, and tell them about the idea of participation, for example, participation in setting budgets and participation in that. But in terms of this, let's have a look at Inessa's question. Hopefully, Coda, I've dealt with your question. Is there a difference between assess and evaluate in terms of the situation and the requirement? They're very similar. Evaluate is very simple, the situation on that. I would suggest if you're going to evaluate, I need good points and I need bad points and a definite conclusion. Assess, I think you can get away with as well, but I don't necessarily see with assess, you just have to decide whether something is actually going to achieve it. So you could deal with this, well, this is the good points and this is the bad points. And again, I think you've got to say a reasonable structure. So if an assess the situation, I would like you to assess whether this umbrella is going to be useful today. So you could identify what's good about it, why you think it would actually help in the context, why you would think not, and conclude. And if you're asking to evaluate, similar structure would do the job quite nicely. Evaluate tends to lend itself into a nice, these are the good points, these are the bad points. Whereas assess, you are going to need to look at the two sides, but you could actually sort of run it right the way down, and you could possibly select a structure by saying, well, for example, we could use return on capital employed because it focuses onto effectiveness as an efficiency in the same ratio. However, it does run the fundamental risk of short-termism in that it will encourage management to take action to improve short-term financial performance, possibly at the longer-term financial performance. As we can see from the case, blah, 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 the company has cut back on training, and this therefore will have the effect of seeing our labour force with less skills, which means they might be demotivated or not able to meet expectations in the future. Bang, and something along those lines. But in terms of this is almost certainly going to be putting down here. Assess and evaluate are the most common questions that you're going to be coming across. On other occasions, they're going to ask you to discuss. So in terms of the discuss side, there's a little slide there. Remember, discuss means have a look at the context you've got in here and bring in all the APM context that you think could explain why this is happening, or basically explain what perhaps the implications of this happening. So for example, discuss the implementation of an enterprise resource planning system. So discuss opens up all of your APM syllabus. How much have you got available to you in your thing? So, well, okay, why am I going to discuss? So let's see, why would we be doing it? It's helping in the information flow. We'll be back to Panis's speed, flexibility, reliability, differentiation and cost. Pick one or two that you could come out from it. Don't forget, of course, if you're going to be discussing, take it right up to the high level. The performance management is all about the actions that management take in order to achieve the objectives whilst maintaining the stakeholder interface. So if it says discuss the implications of, or discuss how we would do the ERPs, or discuss the implications for using the ERPs, you could talk about in terms of how it's going to help you achieve your objectives, how it could help you maintain the stakeholder interface. You could talk about how it's going to help you succeed. And if you remember, critical success factors lead you to KPIs. KPIs allow you to reward, penalize, communicate and control. And that leaves you with the KPIs which can be used to justify and demand change, indicate, inform, monitor and control. Pick what you want. But discuss is far more wide-ranging. It's touching on the academic, but not that sort of frequent idea behind it. So in terms of this situation, that's what you should be really looking for in terms of those cases. Explain means you've got to explain what the principle is. There's a few of those have crept in the recent APMs for small numbers of marks, and they're asking you to focus onto those instances. Occasionally they'll say to you identify, which is simply a case then of identified, but normally it's identify and justify. But everything you're putting in, here is the point, and this is why it's relevant. Here is the point, this is why it will work. Here is the point, this is why we need to deploy it and live the problems that are solved. Never, this is the point. Right? So you must always justify. That is because, see, I'm doing it now, the marker needs to be convinced that you understand the application to the case. Application to the case. As in a situation, hopefully I've solved that tiny. Is it a good idea to put conclusion in the beginning or go to good and bad after for that evaluating? It's entirely up to you. In terms of flexibility, sometimes if your example, the natural thing will be to flow down the good points and the bad points and then reach your conclusion with the final bit at the end. One sentence maximum, please, Tanya. Or alternative, you could actually open the section if you've done your brainstorm and worked out, so on the balance of it, this report is in need of substantial change, and this if for the following would indicate why. So you could then list out what's bad about it and what's good about it. But remember, if you are going to be evaluating from your initial brainstorm, you should realize that perhaps you've got maybe more of the good points than bad points, or vice versa. In which case then that could help you select the design that you're going to utilize and how you might put it in terms of positions there. So certainly there's something along those lines. And have a look, for this weekend, the last weekend you've got, is to go back and looking at all of these requirements and ask yourself, what would I put there? What are they asking? And look at the solution guides and look at the things that's sitting there. Remember, don't learn the solution, learn how to build the solution. Because if you learn how to build a solution, it doesn't matter what question they ask you. You're going to be able to build an answer. But remember, you do need to know what your 3 V's are, your 4 quality costs. You do need to know what the 4 components are in the building block and what the performance pyramid is doing, and the 9 sections or the 9 parts that are involved in the performance pyramid, the building block model, and all these items that you can put in there. So all of these do need to make sure you're there. You need to understand and remember the difference between quantitative and qualitative on corporate failure. You need to understand and remember what Argenti is all about. Remember, just work your way down. But they are not going to say to you, please write all you know about Argenti. What they might say to you is, how useful is Argenti in our case? Okay, so that means you need to understand and pick out in relation to the case. I think that's basically picked out in terms of our example side in relation. So if I'm just going to drop you back down, just to finish off in terms of this slide sitting down that I put up in here for return on capital employed side. So if you're looking down on our return on capital employed, guys, culturally expected, communicates basic ideas, conceptually good. Don't use all of them. Make sure you've got some of them there. Remember, the idea is if you go into any business, generally speaking, they're probably going to be talking or will have seen about return on capital employed, and you're not going to be sending people into massive areas of uncertainty. They've seen it before. Remember, deploying a value-based management concept, we'll see the uses of EVA, new types of measures on maybe sustainability, carbon footprints, which will make existing cultures very nervous because they've never seen it before or understand how it works. But this they've seen before, so it should be easy to deploy. It's very good. It does communicate basic ideas. And the idea of those basic ideas is that management will want the operating profit to go up and the debt and equity, the net asset deployment, to go down. And that is really what we want, because improving our profits will take us over to effectiveness, and reducing our financial base, sitting down in here, it will improve our efficiency. So you do have effectiveness over efficiency, all in one ratio. Sources from the accounting system, that means you're going to be looking at something that is relatively reliable. And of course you do have a relative metric in that you are relating one thing to another, effectiveness to efficiency. On the downside, short-termist risk. As you know, actions taken to improve the short run at the expense of the long run, usually in terms of financial sides behind it. If you wanted to improve this ratio, cutting things like advertising, training, research would see a short-term boost in operating profits. But longer term, you're going to see obviously the profits perhaps start to fall away as your staff lack the skills they need to meet customer expectations, or the research fails to identify new and emerging critical success factors, or the KPIs that you should be using. So in terms of this, you remember short-termism is a massive one. Very, very topical at the moment in performance management industry is the issue about suboptimality. What gets measured gets managed. So if you don't measure it, people won't manage it. And this raises the question here about sexism and racism within organizations. The questions about, shall we say, lack of sustainability, a lack of focus onto social issues. And as business starts to change in these days, then of course, then this is the suboptimality, because we could be taking action to improve one part or one aspect of the business that could have a massive detrimental on the overall business. So you can improve your finances, but the lack of focus on sustainability could ultimately see your organization suffer badly, because you would be developing a competitive disadvantage. And the disadvantage, of course, is ultimately when you're not meeting expectations, but it's not a case of not meeting expectations, you're positively moving in the opposite direction. So what I mean by this is, if I have an expectation that you should not be testing your product on animals, if you don't test your products on animals or anything like that, I'm not going to bother about it, but if you are testing your product on animals, that gives me a reason not to use your product. That's the competitive disadvantage, which in performance management, one of our key things on the research is to understand where our competitive disadvantage lay and how we can shut it down. On the other side, please don't forget you've got age improvement and the fact that this misleads. The formula is fundamentally flawed. You do have subjectivity in here, depreciation, changes in provisions, accruals, etc. And you also have the subjective problem, because if you are going to deploy return on capital employed to evaluate a management team, you're going to need to decide what is controllable by that management team so they can then ultimately feed in terms of those positions. The calculations, more recently, they have asked you to calculate. In September, they asked you to calculate an ROCE, and hundreds of candidates couldn't calculate it. Hopefully, you've had a look at Fiatis and Resillos and made sure that your calculation of your ratio is absolutely spot on. So in terms of this, remember, return on equity, you've got different figures, which is sitting down here. So if you were looking for shareholder focus, always a recommendation down there in the ROE. Very frequent, and there's going back down to, I think it was Tanya's question earlier on, about the idea of your KPIs. You are going to be evaluating KPIs, you're going to be suggesting KPIs. So if something's a good KPI, we perhaps would need to have a look at it. How can we link, how can we decide if something's good? Well, if we can link it to a critical success factor from the case, great news. But then look for balance, if you've got conformance and non-conformance, we've got to focus on to quality. And remember that third part of question 2 on your mock examination, I was going to ask you about the non-conformance and conformance costs. Remember, it's extremely unlikely they're going to ask you to explain it, because they did that in June. They gave you 8 marks. Basically, some people weren't able to really pick that up. But in terms of the other side in relation to it, you're going to think about then, upstream and downstream. Remember, upstream is a determinant. Downstream measures whether you've succeeded or not. So if you measure upstream, you're likely to influence future success identifications. Let's deal with the next question come up from Inessa. Is it always useful to include EVA metric focus when we're talking about KPIs in terms of investors? Certainly equity investors, Inessa, I would certainly say so. And certainly the justification you can put about that in terms of EVA being part of value-based management. Remember, it is the KPI. It will promote goal congruence between the owners and the management team. They're going to be moving in the same direction. They've got more objectivity in it, in that we've taken out the subjectivity involved with profits. But yes, EVA is a nice measure. But remember, if it is in terms of a situation on the flip side, EVA is very easy to understand the result, but the calculations are quite difficult for lay people or non-financial specialists, even some financial specialists. It's very difficult for them to understand what's going on. So in that circumstance, one does need to be a little bit careful, because the complications of the calculations. If you think back to the time when we were reviewing EVA calculations, the head scratching that had to go on there, you guys are almost qualified chartered accountants. So you just imagine how you're going to try and explain this to somebody who's not financially minded. So in answer to your first part there, include EVA in the metric focus? Yes, why not? When I reviewed with you guys in terms of the June examination, if you remember the other night, we talked about fault, asked us to recommend some KPIs, and we had the venture capitalist and the management team was sitting down there. And I said, well, let's measure EVA. It's based on value creation. It includes financial and in the value-based management includes financial and non-financial. From the financial perspective, we have EVA. From the non-financial, we'd have things like customer satisfaction, carbon footprints, all those wonderful little things sitting down there, the gender balance statistics, all focusing around on value-based management. Remember, you do have to manage the stakeholder interface. So it's quite possible, that some stakeholders will be more concerned and say, well, if I'm going to be involved with your business, do I have the reassurance that you're not going to be sexist, racist, or anything along those lines, which are not appropriate for me as a business to be involved with you as a business in. So in terms of this one, yes, I would talk about that. Just stick with traditional financial measures. Though you have to tailor your financial measures in there. So if you have shareholders, use your EVA, but you must understand or make sure that you have the application correct. So if they're talking about not-for-profit organisations, EVA may not be the best application. So it's talking about in terms of cash flows, looking in terms of the future side behind it. You can pick anything out from this. I mean, if you pick something and say, well, what should I measure? So what's important? So maybe we should measure it. So as a firm of chartered accountants, what's important to me, myself and my colleagues is, we've got a good team of people and we don't want them to leave. So in terms of position, very much like the fault case in June, situation where they asked us about HR. And HR, of course, critical success factors to attract top talent, but also to hang on to those that we want to. So measure KPIs. Well, I need to retain my staff, so let's measure retention. So in terms of staff turnover per quarter, or the percentage, something like that, or something along those lines. What percentage of staff are leaving the business? And remember, that's a downstream measure. So then put an upstream to go with it, maybe in terms of staff absenteeism. Remember, it's all very well using these and grasping these guys, but you have to make sure that they are relevant to the case. Simply plucking them and sticking them in the answer without the understanding of the application will do nothing more than communicate to your marker that you are dumping information that you have pre-learned. Never a good idea. Anyway, hopefully in terms of dealt with the issues there. So let's see if I can get this back on. Oh, no, come on. So let's see, we got anything sitting down there? I'm just moving over here onto the other side. Right, Mohammed, in terms of Gibran, sorry, in terms of this, what changes to big data and new areas added? Big data's been in here for the last year in terms of Gibran. Big data's been there. You need to make sure you know what the 3 V's are, which are taking you down to the area there, which are volume, variety and velocity. You need to make sure what they are, and you will need to be able to apply them into the case. They might ask you to explain them, but that will be a small proportion of that. But like all things on your syllabus, that is just 20% of the assessment, 20 to maybe 25. The other 75 here, Gibran, is to take you very much into the line here and getting you to write and apply to the case. So feel free to use big data if you feel that maybe the case lends itself, if the technology context works quite nicely with it, then why not? It could fit in very, very nicely in relation to those issues. But in terms of the big data, so we can see what in terms of that, yeah, why not? But don't expect 25 mark essay on what is big data. Use it wherever you want to. What will big data do? It's nice. It'll improve the speed, the relevance, the reliability, and the failure cost will go down. And at the same time, you'll start to be able to do things perhaps you've never done before, which are the 5 technology factors which are sitting in position. So Mohammed, situation, nice to see you for a situation from Pakistan. Hopefully I've answered all of your questions that are sitting down here or now. I'm just moving back over onto the other streams sitting down so we can see. Okay, so let's go and just pick out something down from here. Some of the other factors which are important side. You remember in terms of staying with ratios, just in here to take you down to this position here. The idea of the gearing. Now in 2018 there you are talking about financial gearing and operational gearing, and I need you to make sure that you have this very clear in your mind. Strictly speaking, anybody who just talks about the gearing is being a little bit vague. So either they're deliberately being vague or they are just ignorant. So you have to decide. You need to make sure you tell me exactly what it is. Financial gearing refers to capital structure. Your F9 studies, financial management, or your P4 in terms of advanced financial management, whatever form you're looking at there, debt over debt plus equity is looking at risk from their positions, etc. But sometimes perhaps more relevant from this case will take you down to the operational side. And if you're looking at operational side, variations of forms in there, but operational gearing refers to the proportion of your cost base that is a fixed cost. And that's quite important because if you change the level of operations, remember this fixed cost base doesn't change. So if level of operations comes down, you are going to very quickly expose a hard core of overhead cost, which means you've got your high break-even point and start to make losses. 2 sides to every story though, of course. What happens then if you go to the other extreme in relation to this is, of course, if once you've covered this very high fixed cost, you're earning contribution at a very high margin and profits will increase at a significant rate. Please do make sure that you're fully familiar with what EBITDA is as well. It's about time somebody asked you to do this again. Remember, earnings before interest, tax and depreciation is one of the early days of the NOPAT classifications, etc. So there it is. Remember, and what I want you to think about is that if you take earnings before interest and tax, as I was trying to put across to you the other day, that this is operating profit. Your operating profit is the earnings before interest and tax. So what EBITDA is, it's saying operating profit before depreciation and amortization. As you can see, the starting point of the idea from here. We have a question in the house. Let's go and see. Kola, you have here. Where we have lots of essays to read or lots of numbers in a question, what tech will you recommends? Well, you've got to read it, and so you have to balance this situation. I am suggesting to you that you have, well, they're going to be doing this on maybe 50 minutes for a section B. What you should have noticed here, Kola, is in terms of these previous APM questions is the actual volume is actually slimming down just a little bit. That's bad news because if the volume slims down, that is giving us less to assimilate. You need to decide how quickly and basically you can read and make sure you're picking out the items. My guidance to you is you should spend a maximum of 15 minutes reading the requirement, the tasks, seeing what's in the question, doing some basic brainstorm on some of the ideas, and that would leave you with 35 minutes to deliver the answer. But that only works, and this is what you must really fine-tune this weekend, 35 minutes to deliver 25 sentences is very doable if you know what it is you are going to write. Now, over a 25-mark question, Cola, what I'm saying is before you start reading the material or the content, is you look at the tasks. So if you've got calculations over here, something talking about general, what is the impact on performance management, you can formulate some ideas from APM principles right at the beginning, and then read the case. And for me, I sit down in terms of positions. I read a paragraph, quick read of the paragraph, see what it's about. Then I go through it again, picking out what I think are the salient points relevant to the requirement. So Cola, the first thing you must do is read the requirement before you read the text. Make sure you have fully identified all of the tasks in the requirement in terms of the circumstances. And then as you're reading the text, you can see bits of text that will be relating to which elements. And from time to time, you'll see paragraphs which simply repeat the requirement. So there's no value added there for you. You can just cross it out and don't need to worry about it again. What you're looking for in the text is then giving you information which is giving you the opportunity to take something from the case, to use that context to justify a point that you're going to put in the answer. Yeah, so in a case, one of the questions before, there was a question called Bazille. I don't know if any of you guys remember Bazille from June last year. And in the Bazille case, there was a gentleman, a manager saying, I've cut back on the training. I thought this was a waste of time and we need to keep money within the business. So you could see that in there. Don't write all of that out because everything that's in the case is known. It's deemed known. You don't have to write whole case material out again. So you say, well, as we can see with the manager's comments about training, they don't see the value in the short term, and this runs the massive risk of short-termism. So rather than define the short-termism, you could then use the context as the definition. So if we cut back training in the short term here, we'll see a cutback in the cost and improvement in short-term profits. But longer term, we have a demotivated, ill-equipped labour force, which is probably going to lead to some significant disadvantages for us. And so you used it in terms of, so you've then integrated the solution. Rather than just dump down into this and say, here is my definitions. And the examiner's reports, which, by the way, I've loaded the last two up, March and June for you in this evening's circumstances, is if you please make sure you have a good, close view on that, because they are saying to you in either, there you go, this one here from June 2019, I've already highlighted out some points, which actually I'm going to go through in terms of this one. So just to wind up here, Cola, what I would say to you here, if you've got a large amount of material, we need to assimilate that material as quickly as possible, work out what's relevant and not relevant, work out which ones are part of the requirements need brainstorming and which ones we can just feed our way into, and then put all your headings up, and then work between the headings. So remember, all headings are open for the entire 50 minutes. When 50 minutes are up, you walk away and all headings would be incomplete. Well, they are, but you have content under all of the headings. I want you to work on the basis that you will never have enough time to write a full answer for A, B, or C. Okay, so put as much as you can in, use your brainstorm, identify relevant content from the case, put it with your APM application side behind it, use your business acumen, and then maybe even sit down so you can build out your answer. And say, what I can say to you is, Coda, you have focused very much onto one of the critical success factors for APM. And we're going to examine you next week, Wednesday morning, 10 o'clock UK time. So I think it's Wednesday anyway. Sitting down in UK time, and that's what we're going to ask you. We're not going to be impressed by your knowledge of APM material. We are going to be impressed by your application of the material content to the case at hand, working under extreme time pressure to deliver and meet the objective. Your meeting of the objective, remember, you need to secure 50 in terms of this position. Hopefully I've answered in terms of your Cola's question. Tana's asked, how long should we plan 50-mark question? Tanya, that's an open-ended question. If you look in terms of fault, for example, in June, the case was very short. But if you actually look down in terms of December at Rosillo's, the case has 3 appendices going over 3 pages. So you have to make that decision. You have to make that flexibility. Now, with a 50-mark case question, remember you're writing the report. I would always suggest to you right at the beginning, write your report on, who it's to, and then that one sentence that summarizes up what those 5 or 6 things they've been asking you to do in the question. Stick it on the top there. But then when you're looking at this, as you've seen when we've reviewed these questions, on the case question, is that some of them, sometimes they don't need brainstorming. They just, you need to feed your way into some of the numbers. Others just need a little bit of a brain dump, like in June they asked you to explain the quality costs. Well, you don't need to brainstorm that. You can actually put a plan structure. It takes about 20 seconds to say what I meant by the quality costs. Oh, that's conformance and non-conformance, internal failure, external failure. Done. And there's your structure, and then you produce the information. But another question is going to say to you, what is the potential impact on performance management of a move towards greater sustainability within the business? And then you're going to need to brainstorm that. You're going to need to have a look at in the case and decide on what you're going to pick. Because you should be now thinking about the fact, and for those of you sitting here, I can see some of you listening here in terms of where we've been doing various courses over the last 2 weeks or so. Remember, there are 20 items. If I said to you, well, what is the impact on performance management? We're saying to you in terms of positions there, well, realistically, we've probably got 20 different items that could come out from it, maybe something along those lines. What are those 20 items? What do you think? Should we see if we can find 18 of them anyway in terms of positions? Do you remember the R's, the T's and the D's? Performance management includes focus onto research, relevancy and reliability of input. Performance management involves selecting appropriate techniques, making sure the staff are trained on how to use it and how to put it together, and also making use of teams where needed for that range of opinion and expertise. Also on the other side, you must think about the data pile. Remember the security issues, the legal issues, and the big data opportunities. Mohammed, if you're listening to that, remember big data opportunities. But also don't forget on your distribution list of performance management constantly, who needs to know, what do they need to know, when and what format should I deliver. Constant flux, that is. And don't forget your reports, because remember the reports are going in with internally and externally. And you need 4 design criteria: narrative, numerical, pictorial, and selection of comparators. See, there's 9 aspects of performance management. And do you remember the other 6 that will take you down in terms of 6 C's, which are going to take us up to 15 of them in terms of positions? The idea in terms of cost and culture and communication and critical success factors, comparators and control. There's another 6 there. 3 S's will take you to short-termism, sub-optimization, and let's put in here subjectivity as well, which will take you up in terms of the 18 side behind it. And then if you're coming down onto the other side behind all of this, then if you want the other two I put in and say, well, let's think about measurement and reward. Well, the measurement, you've got JIM, and reward, financial and non-financial. Remember, reward's got 4 component parts: financial, non-financial, short-term and long-term. Design your reward appropriately, because in performance management, one is going to need to motivate humans in performance management. And that means you've got to put a design on the reward. 2 things involved in performance. One is humans, the other are machines. You don't need to reward machines, you just need to maintain them. So in terms of that, and make sure that they're replaced at the appropriate time. So going back to your question here, Tanya, about a 50 mark, it depends. What you need to go into it, I would suggest that you look into this position, you go straight away and get your tasks identified out and then make that decision. If there's 5 tasks sitting down there, you can see maybe an easy one and 1A and 1F. There's some calculations in the middle, one brainstorm and the other one about in terms of the KPI side behind it. I would have thought, therefore, that in terms of the case, rather than you planning all of the case, because by the time you finish planning part F, you've forgotten what the hell was going on for part A, is you've got to think about the generic capture points and then say, well, okay, let's gather some ideas on this and then let's see where we're going. For question A, so different challenges from different parts of the syllabus. And what we're looking for is your flexibility to look at it. So hit the target. So 95 minutes, all headings have all got some content underneath them. And of course, remember, we're going to spend our time putting easy bits under each of the headings. Inessa, hopefully, Tanya, I've answered your question. I've used the term several times in different questions. Is it sufficient to explain it only in the first question, not repeat again? The answer to your question is yes, in terms of the circumstance. So if you're coming down from the position, if I'm reading your answer book and you're telling me what short-termism is in the first question I'm reading in the answer book, then there's no need for you to continually repeat it. I then fully understand that you understand what it is. Okay, so if you're doing question 2 first, you're going to use short-termism, then you define it. Because remember, question 2, in your answer book, you can have question 3, 2, 1 or 1, 2, 3 or 2, 3, 1. You can put them in any order. But the question that you put, I want you to make sure that if you decide to do question 2 first, fair enough, into the answer book, A followed by B followed by C. That's the way it should be delivered in your answer book. That's not the way perhaps that you're going to write it. So hopefully we can sort that through for you. So hopefully I've answered in terms of that one for you. With situations now, we're coming down to the end of our mentoring session here, guys. So in terms of this circumstance, I just want to strike you back down to the June paper. The June paper in section 3B, and I once remember I went through Cortina's with you in our time together, and Cortina's was an important one. I read on the media the other day, one candidate described it as the question from hell, which is very disappointing because it wasn't. There's no technical knowledge required at all. It's just required to sit down, follow the instructions, put the figures in the numbers, and away you go. And it gave you some real base points in there. So question 3B, mentioning here, as you can see, I've highlighted it out for you in terms of this situation. Candidates attempted the allocation of 3 questions, often omitted candidates' response from the second part in there. Guys, if you leave things out, you have a problem. Okay? Don't leave anything out. And don't think, oh, I don't know the answer, because there's no such thing in modern management if I don't know the answer. Look at the question, give us your opinion. Get the applications taking place. Because there's no situation here. And the thing about APM, guys, it's not about what is the answer, it's what is your answer. Okay, there are exceptions to this where they say calculate the EVA or calculate the minimax regret. That's focusing on technical knowledge. But if they're asking for the impact on performance management or performance measurement, or they're asking you to evaluate the KPIs, this is situations where you just need to look at them and decide how they work. Yeah, and just use your technical. So this weekend, I really want you to start building your toolkit up and say, look, it doesn't matter what you ask, I will build you an answer. I've only got to get it half right anyway. So I'll build you an answer. And for those people in terms of, think about those poor candidates in June who sat there in 3B, said, I don't know, I can't do anything, and just gave up. I mean, that's it, it's all over. So in terms of this, the understand the circumstances, and again, marginal candidates, if you've missed out part of a question, then you're staying as a marginal fail and not a marginal pass. So I want to get it into your mind. We're going to answer all questions. Some of them will be hard. That is your opportunity, because use your superior examination technique to find 1 or 2 basic points. So remember, the poor candidates will just be doing nothing. So you will shine. If something's core, then the poor candidate's going to deal with that as well. So if it says calculate EVA, please bear in mind everybody's going to be calculating EVA, well maybe most people anyway, because they expect that. It's easy stuff. But remember, keep an idea in terms of this thing here. You can see in terms of general comments here, if I can just take you back to our structures in here. Candidates spending a disproportionate amount of time. So that's necessary in terms of the positions, and now that's not the crucial side behind it, but remember the disproportionate amount of time. 50 marks, case 95 minutes, followed by 50 minutes, followed by 50 minutes, followed by lunch. Yes, and it's the time. So think about the fact it's like you're playing one of those little games. So you used to sit down, so you're in a room, you're there for 50 minutes, and if you are and still in there after 50 minutes, they're going to lock you in, and that's the end of your examination. So in terms of 50 minutes out, 95 minutes in, or 95, and I would suggest you do the case first. Let's get the 30-35 on the board for that. 2 part Bs, lunch. Okay. The other side in terms of this, and the green one, it says, as you can see, many candidates have clearly been taught that they should define in their answer any jargon terms in the question. However, they are wrong. Can you see it? However, they are wrong to assume that this alone will provide them with a passing answer. There are no marks allocated for your definitions. You need to use the definitions to justify a point. Okay, so just think how frustrating it would be at work if every time somebody asked you a question, you started the answer with a definition. Yeah, so think about that. If I asked you what the time is, we'd say it's 6:15. We wouldn't start off with the definition of time or all the other situation. It's just 6:15. And why is that? Well, if I'm looking at the clock and it says 6:15. Done. The other ones you can see, many candidates appear to lack basic knowledge. This is inexcusable. Lack basic knowledge. Or even apply it in terms. Now, this is an application paper. I would put it to you guys, there's actually nothing particularly complicated about it. Okay, you have EVAs and the risk management stuff to deal with, but the rest of it is build me an answer. You have to remember Jim. It's not really in terms of that sort of back-breaking side behind it. The situation, there's something else building on that knowledge, says there's a need throughout the examination to relate or illustrate points by using the information in the scenario. I think that coda might go back to one of your points earlier on, just in there. Everything has to come from the scenario or the context of the scenario, a service business, an NFPO. So don't start bringing things in that you've learned to deploy. Make sure that you can build them so you can see. The other one is sitting down here, please candidates to answer the question asked and not what they hoped for. For many of you in your mock examinations, guys, I'd like to reiterate that. Yes. How would Porter's 5 forces help the performance management? Not do Porter's 5 forces analysis. And of course, how Porter's five forces would do there is it identifies critical success factors in the environment relating to opportunity and threat. They can then be used to develop KPIs. So we can use those KPIs to reward and manage, develop control systems and communicate the need for change as we revolve around it. That's how Porter's five forces work. It's a basic starting point. It's a data capture system. So if you capture data, you can turn it into information and knowledge. It's not a case of here are the five headings and I'm doing the analysis. And for many of you in your mock examination, that Porter five forces question, most of you admitted the fact that I asked you for KPIs to go under each of the headings. So very few of you offered me any KPIs. And just some of you that did, KPIs are not areas to look at. A KPI is very specific. Operating margin percentage is a KPI. Looking at profit is not a KPI. Looking at sustainability, not a KPI. Measuring your carbon footprint per head of staff is a KPI. And so you can start to pick out and see how these things are working and how they're doing there. I've loaded both of these up. Please make sure you have a good solid read of this in terms of this. I know I've worked with some of you in terms of this as before, but you can see it says many candidates, here's several examples, candidates answering a slightly different requirement from the one that's asked, or simply ignored a part of the requirement. Guys, this is simply inexcusable. And in terms of my marking situation, if you've just ignored a part of the question, then that is, as far as I'm concerned, that is you ignoring a specific instruction from the client or your manager, and you're not going to get away with that. So in terms of that, we call that either basically call it incompetence, and so you can't pass. I want you to think about it, focus it. I need to be answering every task. The chances of me doing brainstorming, very minimal. Here, you need to be capable of analysing and evaluating the situation. I think it was in essence said the difference when you look, evaluate a situation. Using their technical knowledge is fundamental to the marker's judgment for you to be competent here. Can you evaluate? That's all these questions, vast proportion of them are. Evaluate and assess. Some majorly important things in here. So here we go. It says there are a number of issues that arose, while not common to all answers, would certainly represent in these areas. Look at this. The team, or the boss, is highlighting critical success factors. First one, failing to read the specific requirement. Practice this weekend. Are you getting caught out with the questions? How are you going to get around it? Spending a great deal of time giving definitions. Don't. Use the definitions as part of the explanation. Examination based on this. Remember, the examiner's board, APM, yellow here, and examination based on justification and analysis. That's what I need you to be doing, justifying, analysing. Look at the red. Writing almost exclusively in single sentence paragraphs is not conducive to justification. An analysis as such a style tends to introduce a point and does not offer anything by further way of analysis or justification. Remember, I'm suggesting to you your paragraphs need 2 sentences. And here's the point, this is why it's relevant, or here's the point, and the second sentence, this is how it's going to work, and this is why it will work. And in terms, it's to many of you, in terms of your mock examinations, and we're looking down in there, in this position, is that you were making, or certainly one of you was making sort of bullet points as you were coming down the page, which is 4 or 5 words in there. And whilst I was looking at it, I think, well, actually you're in the right area there, but you're not explaining it, you're not justifying it, and therefore you're not scoring anything. Bullet points, no. 2-sentence paragraphs, yes, if you want to put them down, because a paragraph is essentially coming down to that bullet. But look at it, I'll put it in red so you make sure they're there. You understand it. It says in style here, to introduce a point does not offer anything by way of analysis. It's important here for points are made are supported and justified. It is clear a single sentence bullet point style is the very antithesis of that. So if you're going to make a sentence, here is the point and this is why it's relevant. You might need a second sentence. For example, the second sentence is required to justify to the marker that I understand the application. See, I've just done it there. 2-sentence paragraph, made the point and justified at the end of it. Please make sure you absorb this. Another one, look at this situation, not sticking to specific question requirements. Now this is called question creep. Now what happens is somebody reads the question, then they put it down and they start writing the answer and they never look at the requirement again. I would suggest to you, you put the requirement and have it on the top of the desk while you're writing. So as you're thinking about the point, you can read the question in the requirement, run the answer through your mind and then write the answer to it. Read the requirement again, write your next point in answer to it. You see a slight deviation, and if you're not checking back, before too long you'll find yourself answering this, the idea of answer creep. not sticking to the specific question requirement. So you can see this guy is telling you here, we've got to be very focused on this to make sure that we address this. And many of you, in terms of still there, offering unjustified, commercially naive suggestions. Now, the naivety you'll get away in terms of business acumen, but the unjustified element behind it, I'm afraid you'll never get away with this situation on this one. So which demonstrate a lack of understanding, so suggesting that an ALP system was available for question 1, 4 and 3A. So that's never going to work. That's not the reason you're going to fail this exam. You're not going to fail. I want you to pass it. The reason you will pass it is I need you to keep a very close eye on these things that are sitting here in the examiner's report. On this page, I've highlighted them up for you so you can see them, you can look at it and thinking, how do I make sure that I avoid that? 2 to go. Making the same point repetitively. Again, from some of you, not very many of you, if you're making the same point repeatedly, you're talking about culture change at the top of the page and then talking about culture change just with different words at the bottom of the page, you're making the same point twice. So this is pretty clear to the marker then that you haven't planned properly. So the essence of this success is to build your technique up so you can structure the question, plan, brainstorm, select content, know what it is you want to write, and then start writing. Master that, you will do very well at APM. But look at this, making the same point repetitively, just coming down, and you come up with these little things we write. There's the idea of PAG, and it says point already given. So we've awarded the mark once, and now you're just wasting sentences again. The other one, please try to ensure both handwriting and layout answers is clear. Your markers are well experienced with dealing with handwriting, but as you know, handwriting will be coming to an end in 2020 in ACCA. But the idea in terms of handwriting down in this position, slow it down, just make sure we can read it. But in terms of that, but from time to time, I've always been a little bit suspicious over the year, thinking that some people say, well, if I'm squiggling my handwriting, the mark will just assume I'm correct. I'm afraid the answer is no. If we can't read it, if you're in doubt or we're in doubt, you get an out. All right, so make sure, think about that. Remember, read, plan, brainstorm, decide, then write your answer. 3 separate things. Don't mix them all up. 3 separate things. Sitting down there is a list of key performance indicators for you. I'd like you to focus, and you'll find very similar things that the examining team were writing about back in March as well. There's some nice stuff sitting around just in here from question 1, fault, that I did with you the other night. In terms of circumstances, in the red one sitting down there, you can see it's clear that many candidates felt that justifying the measures they had offered could be undertaken by providing a definition of that term. That's crass stupidity. It doesn't say define the ratio, it says explain why the ratio would be relevant. You remember, we've did fault on, what are we on here, Monday, no, Tuesday, whenever it was, Monday night, whenever, and we sat down in terms of this position. Have a look at those cases, because I've done the ones released, I've done fault, I've done Cortinas and Vulgarum or whatever it is, and have a look at those questions, very topical. Focus your attention and make sure you're sitting here dealing with the APM side. Perfect preparation, ladies and gentlemen, presents perfect performance. There they are. To answer that question, keeps coming up. What are the coulds, musts, shoulds, do's and all this stuff, guys? Every one of these cases, everything on this document that I have provided for you is a must. I need you to have built a file with each one of these questions. So you've got the question, you've got my answer, you've got further thoughts of other things you think might come in, what you thought the trick was, why the examiner was putting in, which parts were easy parts. Because basically you'll see some of these structures start to repeat themselves as they stand. I did all of these in terms of our times in here. You've got all these other ones to look at in there as well. So this weekend, as you're prepping in terms of this, reviewing the question. And if you feel that you want to top up your technical knowledge, then go to the revision notes, everything you need in there. And if you want more than that, just Google the term. But remember, we are doing that so you can create an understanding of what the term is. We are not doing that to get information that we are going to dump down in the examination. I'm going to be very clear about that. I've been saying it for the last 10 weeks or so, but of course there's always people that tend to ignore exactly what they're saying, go back and start writing essays as if they were at university or doing their A-levels again. Remember, this is not an academic assumption. This is not an academic exam. In fact, you should think of it as a work simulation where you're going to demonstrate the characteristics that would make you a very employable person. Working under pressure, analysing what's required of you, analysing information and data to sit there to work out what it is, planning, delivering information to stakeholders and building a logical answer that other stakeholders can trust. That's what's getting examined on Wednesday in terms of the positions. What sort of areas? Well, I mean, people say, well, what are the tips? The tips are planning. The tips are brainstorming. The tips are structuring the question. The tips are gathering the information and making sure that we answer the question. Please note this situation, I'm not saying to you activity-based costing. Yeah, they're not going to get questions in these positions. But if we were just to finish off to think about this, if we can start batching some of these things together. Corporate failures in Section E, they've got to put something in terms of Section E. It's a standalone topic. I would commend a period of time for you to work those questions, get a good thing, and think, yeah, in terms of the ideas. Costing systems, you know, the idea has been done quite a lot. The costing systems of target costing, life cycle costing, done in June. When you come across in terms of activity-based costing, and they've really picked out an activity-based management, those sort of ideas, they tend to find that, and they've been, shall we say, quite heavily done in March and June. Right, come over here to the ideas of performance measurement. Right, the idea of performance measurement. The idea of performance measurement, you remember the loop, you know, critical success factors, KPIs, and taking you out to think about in gym. Make sure you've got a good solid, this is always examined, performance measurement. You're also going to have performance management, always examined. So you're going to find a proportion of your examinations sitting down there. Other topics we could start to think about a possibility of manufacturing systems. So this would take us down to manufacturing, where we're down to things like TQM, VBM, lean systems, any of these things. That could be certainly something to put into this. On the technology, knowledge management systems have been included for the first time. Remember, it's just terms of technology. Any technology, if you remember, has the benefit of speed, flexibility, reliability, differentiation and cost. And then we might find ourselves sitting down here with possibility of something relating to budgeting. I'm in the way of that, aren't I? Budgeting. And just so we can think about it in terms, I'm going to put it over here, budgeting systems. Yes, in terms of the idea of the budgeting. Bit of risk. Remember the marks, the situations. Now, if you start looking across all of those, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 7 areas that are going to come in, and they'll probably do all of these, I would have thought. In terms of these positions, the ones that definitely are going to be there are your performance measurement questions and your performance management questions. Now, what I mean by performance measurement, they might ask you to use a framework or to work within the context of a framework. They're not going to ask you to explain the framework. They're not going to ask you to draw the diagram. They're going to ask you how useful it is. Or you might even need to come over to the lean systems where they might be asking you to improve it. Technology, possibly, but of course, if you then look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, this has been done a lot recently. This was done a lot recently, side than that. So maybe manufacturing, corporate failure, technology, or some risk-based area. Personally, I would have a little bit of a combination perhaps of either corporate failure or technology-based question. And then maybe on the other one, maybe something on manufacturing linked into a risk. But if you look at that and think about the areas, those are your areas. So build them out from it. Remember the idea in terms of the frameworks, these are not topics. There we have, in terms of our structures, ladies and gentlemen, we are just about to run out of time. Let's go and see in terms of our colleagues here in terms of Facebook. What do we got in terms of this one? The situation, when is P4? I'm sorry, I have no idea. You're on a APM situation in this one. In terms of NAWA, I can't help you on that one. If you have any APM questions here on the Facebook link, please feel free to pick them out in terms of circumstance and in terms of the ideas there, we'll deal with it. I think P4, I think it's already happened in terms of that. In terms of the workroom, ladies, gentlemen, we're at 6:30. Our time together has come to an end. You can get hold of me on the email to raise in terms of questions, and several of you have sent me emails which I will deal with for you in face-to-face, or I'll do them on here now for you if you want to, but of course everybody else can see them. If you tend to wait for the morning, I'm going to be sitting, I'm not teaching tomorrow morning, I'm going to work my way through all of your requests, the ones that you've sent through, and send them back to you. But anyway, sorry, in terms of the situation, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure working with you. I hope you found this session and the other sessions, our 5 revision sessions, our 8 tuition sessions, in terms of those positions, useful. And I wish you luck. Do let me know how well you get on. Let me have your thoughts about what you thought about in terms of positions there on Wednesday. Panis, it's been a pleasure working with you. I do hope we won't need to talk again about APM, but of course, always happy to talk about anything else. All right, so in terms of this, ladies, gentlemen, farewell. And I'll see you, hopefully, in a social environment.